We're going to revisit this topic of autism spectrum disorder, and this is something I did about a year ago. But I think it's great to revisit information, especially as we get new people participating. And we kind of are hearing a lot about autism in the media lately. And I know there's a lot more diagnoses coming out, especially in the Huntsville area. And so I thought it was a great time to come back around, talk about autism spectrum disorder, disperse some or dispel some myths maybe that they were floating around about the disorder, and also some ways, some strategies that we can better understand our loved ones who have this diagnosis and better care for them, right? As you know, I believe education is one of our greatest resources in the cultivation of compassion. And autism spectrum disorder, I think, is one of those diagnoses that requires a lot of understanding and a lot of compassion, especially if you are parenting or raising someone very young with this disorder, this diagnosis. Of course, compassion, I think, is a key component to any parenting situation. But a lot of times we can misconstrue some of the expressions of autism as misbehavior or disobedience. And our culture's inclination is to discipline, right? And to try to get that behavior out of our children. And so I want to hopefully maybe clarify some of the expressions of autism spectrum disorder, so that you can help you navigate your parenting and maybe adjust your style a little bit. That'll be more fruitful for you and your loved one going forward. So there's a lot of information I'm going to cover today. If you have any questions as I go through this information, I do ask that you either put it in the chat or wait until the end, so that way I can get the full information, the full recording to put on our YouTube channel and our website. And then we can always do questions afterward if you want to stick around. But this probably will take the full hour. And so if you want to dismiss after this information is presented, you're more than welcome to. You don't have to stick around for the conversation. I promise it won't hurt my feelings, okay? But before we begin, I would like to ask, for those of you who are willing to participate in our post survey, would you mind putting your email address in the chat? I will send you the survey afterward, and this is just an opportunity for you and I to connect, and I can get your feedback, your critiques, your suggestions, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that going forward, I have a nice baseline for how I can present information or give information, or what information I share with you in future trainings. So I really appreciate your feedback if you're willing. Of course, it's not mandatory, but it's always appreciated. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this information today. But before, again, let's get into it and then let's not. So let's start this real quick before we begin. I want to let you know that I am not a medical professional, okay? So I do not diagnose or treat autism spectrum disorder right now. I do have my licensure to be able to do those therapies, but as it stands, this presentation is purely for educational purposes, okay? I'm not trying to treat anybody. I'm not trying to diagnose anybody. And we don't want to use this as a substitute for medical and professional advice, therapeutic care, okay? This is just going to be a broad overview to help kind of clear up some misunderstanding about the disorder, and not for any other purpose than that, okay? So if you have diagnosis-specific questions based off of your experiences in your caregiving role, I would just recommend that you reach out to your doctor or your practitioner that you're currently working with to get those questions answered. I can, of course, answer general questions, but the specific case type information, I'm not in a position to be able to answer those questions for you, okay? So just keep that in mind as we go forward. So here's my agenda. It's a little bit longer than what they normally are, but again, I have got a lot of information to go over today, and so this is going to be a very heavy information-based training. So we're going to define autism spectrum disorder, and we're going to dispel some of those myths and misconceptions. We're going to talk about some of the signs, symptoms, causes, risk factors of autism spectrum disorder. And we're going to talk a little bit about how it's diagnosed. A lot of people are saying, well, there's so many diagnoses nowadays. Well, I'm going to kind of let you know why that is. And then also we're going to talk about any potential treatment options, some caregiver tips, and then we're going to go through what I think is one of the more important subjects of today, are behaviors versus misbehavior. Now, we are trying to switch language from behavior to expression, but I did do this training a year ago, and so it's got some of the older language in it, so forgive me as we go forward. And then I'm going to try to help bring some clarity to what we call autistic meltdowns at the end. And again, this is going to be recorded. It's going to be shared on our website. So if there's anything that you missed or want to revisit or go back and listen to again, you're more than welcome to. The recordings will be placed on our website early next week, if not this afternoon. Okay. So what is autism spectrum disorder? So throughout this presentation, you'll probably hear me use the term ASD, which is just an acronym for autism spectrum disorder. So this is a neurological and developmental disorder, and it affects how people interact with other people, right? How they communicate, how they learn, how they behave. Okay, a lot of the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder will come about during social interactions, and we'll clarify that a little bit more as we go through. But autism can be diagnosed at any age. It is described as a developmental disorder, however, because symptoms will generally appear in the first 2 years of life. Okay, there are people who get diagnosed with autism later in life. That is not uncommon, but it is not the standard. Okay, autism is known as a spectrum disorder because there's a wide variation in the type and the severity of the symptoms that people experience. Okay, so if you've met one person who has autism, guess what? You've met one person with autism, right? You can't meet one person with autism and say, well, this is how people with autism are, right? That's how that person with autism is. Okay, so it's a spectrum, which could be why it's kind of difficult to understand, because you might know 3 or 4 people who have this diagnosis, and their behaviors or their expressions are different, and so you're like, well, what is this even, right? This doesn't make any sense to me. Okay, so hopefully we can get some clarification going forward. So people of all genders, all biological sex, all races, all ethnicities, all economic backgrounds, all education levels, right, can be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. It affects all of us in any demographic you can think of. Okay, it's not a specific type of person that gets autism spectrum disorder. Okay, it can be anybody. And though autism spectrum disorder can be a lifelong disorder, because it is, again, a developmental disorder or neurological disorder, there are treatments and services that will improve a person's symptoms and help them function daily. Okay, and again, it's a spectrum, right? So there are going to be people on one side of the spectrum, there's going to be people on the other side of the spectrum, and their needs are going to be much different. Okay, but there are treatments, there are things that can be used to improve the functioning of the individual based off of their needs. Okay. And the reason why we're seeing a lot of these diagnoses pop up is because now the American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending that all children receive screening for this disorder. Okay, so you should talk to your child's healthcare provider about the screening and evaluation, and I will give you a very generic overview of what that looks like later on in the next few slides. Okay, but now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and tackle some of these myths and misconceptions. Now, I do have 3 slides of these because there are a lot of unknowns, a lot of misinformation, and it seems like every time I turn around, there's a new myth being preached as gospel to people. And so I really hope that this helps clarify and gives you the tools and the resources to advocate for your young one or your older one, whomever has the disorder. And when these myths and misconceptions come up in your circle, right, in your space. So the first one, the myth is that the appearance of autism is relatively new. I'm sure you've all heard people say, well, we didn't have autism when I was growing up. This is new, right? Well, the reality is that autism was first described by a scientist named Leo Cranner back in 1943. But even then, the earliest known description of a child who had autism was written in 1799. Okay, so that's over 200 years ago, if my math is right, which hopefully it is, and I didn't just embarrass myself in front of everybody. But anyways, so ongoing research and improvements in the way we diagnose, and identify autism, the characteristics of autism, and the fact that it even exists on a continuum with varying degrees of severity, intensity, and frequency. That has contributed to what seems like the explosion of autism diagnoses in our country. Okay. In 2014, the CDC estimated that 1 in 68 children in the United States have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So of course, that statistic is more than 10 years old. And so the numbers, I'm sure, have changed, but that is the most recent one that I've been able to collect. Next, myth 2, autism is a mental health disorder. Well, the truth is autism is a neurological disorder. Okay, so it's about how the brain works, develops, exists. Okay. Studies of people with autism have revealed there are some abnormalities in the brain structure and in the levels of neurotransmitters. So all those chemicals that help our brain communicate with itself, the levels may be different in people who have autism spectrum disorder. Okay. What's commonly overlooked is that individuals with developmental disabilities, they are twice as likely to have co-occurring mental health disorders that also need treatment, right? Or at times it may render them in need of like acute mental stabilization, like a crisis intervention kind of a thing. While also taking into consideration the developmental disability. Okay, so there are what we call comorbidities sometimes. Okay, so mental health disorders can manifest alongside of a person who has autism spectrum disorder. Okay, they're two different diagnoses. Okay. Myth number 3, all individuals with autism have mental disabilities. Okay, a lot of people think that, but the truth is people on the spectrum are unique, right? Just like all of us, with a wide range of intellectual abilities, right? Just like anybody else. People with autism can be harder to test, so IQs and abilities can be under or overestimated in some cases, unless that testing is done by an expert in IDD or intellectual and developmental disabilities, okay, and autism. So if you have just your general practitioner or a general psychologist or doctor doing these screens, they may over or underestimate the abilities. But if you have an expert in the field doing the screening, you're going to get a more accurate conclusion or diagnosis from that. Okay. So tests designed to include language and interpersonal analysis, they may misrepresent the intelligence of people with autism who struggle with social skills. And many people on the spectrum have earned college and graduate degrees, and they work in a variety of professions. I know we have kind of a running joke here in Huntsville that, because we have such a huge engineer population, that's why we have such a high population of people on the spectrum, because we find that vocation tends to lend itself very well to people on the spectrum. But conversely, it is sometimes assumed mistakenly that a person with autism has a higher level of understanding than they do based on their behavior, their language skills, or high level of ability in specific areas, right? We'll go into that a little bit more later. Myth number 4, autism is caused by vaccines. Now, this one I think is kind of one of those big red flags that is being waved around in our culture today. It kind of cropped up in the early 2000s, and then it kind of quieted down after we all educated ourselves. And now it's kind of popping back up in that misinformation space. And so I just really want to address that now, so that way when this comes up in conversations you're having, you are equipped and you can know that there is no evidence that childhood vaccinations cause autism. This originated from a 1998 study that linked autism with vaccines, but it has been retracted since then. So the people who published that, who wrote it, who did that and found that link, they have since retracted that information from further study and more education, okay? So the people who put this myth out there are now saying it's not real, it's not true, they were mistaken. Yet, once the genie's out of the bottle, it's very difficult to put it back in. And so that's what we're seeing now. So numerous studies have confirmed and continue to confirm that there is no direct evidence that links vaccines to the development of autism. Okay, so hopefully that closes that chapter. Myth number 5, autism is caused by poor parenting or quote unquote refrigerator mothers. Okay, so in the 1950s, there was an assumption that autism was created by emotionally distant or cold parents. Although that does tend to cause some issues, some attachment issues growing up, it does not cause autism. Okay, we don't know the exact cause of autism yet, but we know that it is firmly established that the development of autism has absolutely nothing to do with parenting style. So if you've heard that and you've believed that and you've internalized that and you felt guilt over that, please know that is not anything that you have done or didn't do that caused this diagnosis in your child, okay? Or that your parents may have done to cause a diagnosis in yourself, okay? Next. Autism is caused solely by environmental factors. So the truth is, there are genes that have been identified as one of the causes of autism, and parents whose first child has autism are more likely than the general population to have a second child with autism. Identical twin studies have shown that if one twin has autism, the other one has a 90% chance of having it as well. However, environmental factors can contribute to symptom severity in individuals, but it does not contribute to autism diagnosis itself, okay? Number 7, people with autism are violent. Some of these myths I thought were a little cruel, and this is one of them. The truth is, though, there have been some news stories relating autism to violence and aggressive acts, and they usually arise from a sensory overload or emotional distress that the person's experiencing. But it is very unusual for individuals with autism to act violently out of malice or pose any danger to society, right? Just like the everyday Joe or Jane, right? We get angry, we get frustrated, but we are not out there maliciously hurting people or causing problems because of that, okay? And so the same is true for a person who has autism. Many individuals who have autism spectrum disorder will actually prefer to limit their exposure to interactions, not all, but many, limit their interactions with other people because sometimes social situations can feel confusing and be very anxiety producing, okay? Number 8, all individuals with autism have savant abilities, okay? Well, the truth is, there is a higher prevalence of savant abilities among those with autism, but only about 10% of individuals with autism exhibit those savant abilities, okay? So some people with autism have what are called splinter skills, and that just means that they have skills in one or two areas that are above their overall performance ability. So they have a knack or a talent or strength in certain areas that are sometimes misinterpreted as savant or can be given fuel to that myth that all people with autism have savant abilities. And I think this might have been magnified if you remember way back in the day. If you're my age or a little older, there's a movie called Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, and that was my first, remembered at least the first one that I can recall of a mainstream exposure to something like autism, right? And so, of course, the uneducated masses that we were just watching it for entertainment value, it was easy to assume that that's what autism looks like, right? That there's a savant hiding in there somewhere, right? But that's not always the case, okay? And it's very rarely the case, actually. So next, this one I thought was really cruel as well. Individuals with autism do not feel love and are unable or unwilling to form meaningful social relationships. Now, if you have had any interaction with anyone on autism spectrum, you probably know that this is not the truth, right? There may be some people who are less expressive in their feelings of love or emotion, or have an easier time forming meaningful social relationships. But that could be any of us, right? You don't have to have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder for that to be a character trait or personality trait of yours, right? So I'm sure there are some people on the spectrum who have an unwillingness for connection, right? But that could just be the personality trait. And I feel like that would be true of them, whether they had this diagnosis or not, right? So just like there are variations outside of the diagnoses in the way we interact with one another, there are variations inside the diagnoses as well. Okay, so keep that in mind. Let's see here. So many individuals who have autism do have difficulty with social interaction, but they can have close social relationships, fall in love, raise children, right? And some people may express their loving feelings in less obvious ways, but it doesn't mean that they're incapable of experiencing or expressing love, okay? And myth number 10, people with autism are cold and lack empathetic feelings. Again, very cruel. But people with autism feel as much, if not more, empathy than other people. But again, they may just express it in ways that are harder for a neurotypical culture to recognize, right? Some people with autism may seem cold or uncaring if they're very anxious, or if they're expected to show care or empathy in a more quote unquote typical way. Okay, so that societal expectation. They may not meet those societal expectations, but that doesn't mean that they are void of the capacity to feel what the rest of us feel. Okay. And the last one of myths and misconception. People with autism can't stand to be touched. Well, the truth is, this can be true for some people, right? Just like if you are not on the autism spectrum, you might not like to be touched. You're not a huggy person. You're not a touchy-feely person, right? I'm one of those, okay? But if you have high sensory sensitivities, it can be more difficult for you to express physical affection with another person. But many people with autism enjoy hugs, light massage, and other forms of touch, just like the rest of us, right? We're all still very, very human. Next, people with autism have no sense of humor. Well, the truth is that may be true for some people with autism, right? I'm sure we all know somebody who is not on the spectrum who struggles with the sense of humor, right? It's not a diagnosis, it's just a character trait, right? But it is more likely that a person who has autism may express or share humor in unique or less obvious, more subtle ways. Many parents report that their family members who have this disorder, they tease, tell jokes, repeat comedy bits that they've seen on TV, and try to crack jokes, expecting to entertain people. Okay, just like the rest of us. Again, it may be expressed differently, but if you think about it, all of us express humor differently, right? Not everybody is going to be a big old, knee slapper joker. Some people are going to be more dry in their humor. And so there's a spectrum in the way all of us experience and express humor. And so you don't have to assume anyone who's on the spectrum lacks the capacity to have a sense of humor. Okay. And finally, autism can be cured. Well, the truth is there is currently no cure for autism spectrum disorders. However, if we intervene early and intensively with behavioral treatment, in many cases that can reduce the severity of symptoms, and it can help people who have who struggle with adaptive skills for daily living and things like that, emotion and behavior regulation and social engagement. There are treatments available to help them navigate those difficulties, okay? But again, there is no cure. So we're going to go over these a little quickly, just for the sake of time. Some signs and symptoms. So social communication and social interaction behaviors that may be signs that somebody's on the spectrum, okay? So making little or inconsistent eye contact. This one is interesting to me because I do not have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, but I also make inconsistent eye contact. Sometimes staring at somebody intently in the eyes is a lot for me. And so I just kind of, my eyes wander, and I think we all do that. But that is a sign and symptom of autism spectrum disorder. Appearing to not look or listen to people who are talking, infrequently sharing interest, emotions, or enjoyment of objects or activities, including infrequently pointing at or showing things to others. And this is more in regard to probably like a younger one. Again, most of these behaviors or these expressions will pop up by the age of 2, okay? So pointing at or showing things to others, that's a very toddler type thing to do. And so if your young one is not exhibiting those behaviors by a certain benchmark, then they would probably screen for autism. Not responding or being slow to respond to their name, or to other bids for attention, right? Say, hey, honey, come here, and they don't responding to you. Hey, Joey, come here, and they don't hear you, or being slow to respond, okay? Maybe they have difficulties with the back and forth of a conversation, okay? You might see people talking at length about their favorite subject, and they don't notice that other people aren't interested, or they don't give you a chance to respond, okay? So it's kind of like this this inundation of information that you may get because they're not picking up on those social cues to like let the conversation breathe, right? That the conversation is between two people, not just one person. Displaying facial expressions, movements, and gestures that don't match what's being said. So maybe if everybody's bursting out and laughing and then you kind of get a little huh from somebody, right? That could be something. Having an unusual tone of voice that maybe sounds sing-songy or flat and robot-like. Having trouble understanding another person's point of view, or being unable to predict or understand other people's actions. Difficulty adjusting their behavior to different social situations. So, you know, the way that you behave on a playground is going to be different than the way you behave in the classroom, like that kind of thing, right? And then finally, difficulty sharing in imaginative play or making friends. And again, this is for the little ones, right? So these are not all of the symptoms. They're just some of them that we do see when we screen for autism spectrum disorder. And then here's another category, restrictive or repetitive behaviors that can be signs and symptoms. Now, I also want you to keep in mind that just having one or two of these doesn't automatically say, yes, you have autism, okay? When you do screening, they're going to be looking for multiple symptoms and signs, okay? So some common ones, repeating certain behaviors or having unusual behaviors, like repeating words or phrases. And this behavior is called echolalia. Had to look that up, echolalia. Having a lasting intense interest in specific topics like numbers, details, or facts. They have obsessive interests. I did have a friend of mine who was on the spectrum, and it didn't matter what we talked about, it always came back to plants, right? He was just very, very passionate about plants. And so that I would assume would be one of his obsessive interests. Next, showing overly focused interests, such as with moving objects or parts of objects. So a lot of times we'll see little ones who are very intent on spinning the wheels of a toy car or the flashing lights of a specific toy. They're overly focused in that space. Maybe becoming upset by slight changes in a routine and having difficulty with transitions. I do have some adult friends on the spectrum, and if plans change last minute, you know, they need to take a moment and regulate, right? They have to employ those coping skills then, because that transition has happened and it's happened unexpectedly, okay? And when you're younger and you don't have those coping skills, your frustration threshold isn't as sturdy. That's when we have a lot of these, you know, expressions that can come off as, you know, tantrums and things like that, which we'll go into later. But of course, as an adult, you know, they've learned how to kind of navigate that a little bit better. And so they just, I need a minute to process, and then they're fine, okay? Maybe they're more sensitive or less sensitive than other people to sensory input, like light, sound, clothing, or temperature, right? I have some friends where if, you know, they have microfiber on their skin, you know, they might as well just peel their skin off. It feels so uncomfortable, right? Whereas some of us, you know, we like the feeling of microfiber, okay? And also people who have autism spectrum disorder, they may experience sleep problems and irritability, okay? And then finally, some other characteristics. And this, again, keep in mind, these are going to be probably for younger people. Delayed language skills, delayed movement skills, delayed cognitive or learning skills, hyperactive, impulsive, and or inattentive behavior. Sometimes you'll see somebody who have autism and ADHD together, right? So some of these symptoms overlap. Epilepsy or seizure disorder, unusual eating and sleeping habits, gastrointestinal issues like, for example, constipation, unusual mood or emotional reactions, anxiety, stress, or excessive worry, and lack of fear or more fear than expected, okay? Some strengths though. So people with autism also have many strengths. So they may be able to learn things in detail and remember information for long periods of time. They may be strong visual and auditory learners, and they may be excelling in math, science, music, or art, okay? So we're going to go over some causes and risk factors. Okay, so we do know that researchers do not know the primary cause for autism spectrum disorder, but studies do suggest that a person's genetics can act together with certain aspects in their environment that affect the development in ways that lead to autism spectrum disorder. Okay, so we haven't hit the nail on the head yet, but we are definitely following the trail of breadcrumbs to their source. Okay, so some factors that are associated with an increased likelihood of developing autism spectrum disorder is having a sibling who has autism spectrum disorder, having parents who are maybe a little older than what we typically would think a new parent or somebody having children would be, having certain genetic conditions like Down syndrome or Fragile X syndrome, or having a very low birth weight. So not everyone who has these risk factors, of course, will develop autism spectrum disorder, but these are just some causes and risk factors that we can find the pattern when we do this research and these diagnostics, right? We see these patterns emerging. So how is it diagnosed? So there's a couple stages, but the first one is going to usually happen during that screening during a well child checkup. Like I said before, the CDC has now recommended, or sorry, the Association of Children's Pediatrics has suggested that all children are screened for autism spectrum disorder. Okay. Yes, there's right. I'm trying to think of the name. It's right there on the screen. The American Academy of Pediatrics. So they're recommending that everyone gets screened at their 9-month, 18-month, 24-month, and 30-month well child visits, okay? And specific autism screenings at 18 and 24-month well child visits, okay? So you are gonna get that baby in the doctor. They're going to check the growth. They're going to check the development. They're going to see if everything's on par. But right around their 18 and 24-month screening is when they're going to just go ahead and screen for autism spectrum disorder. That's when we catch it the earliest. And that is when we can get them involved in treatments or therapies that could help them moving forward. Okay. So a child may receive additional screenings if they are at high risk for autism or developmental problems. Okay, so everyone's going to get screened, but if there's a red light or a green light goes off, they're going to be like, well, let's go ahead and do a deeper dive into this diagnosis. Okay. They will also consider the caregiver's experiences and concerns as a very important part of the screening process for young children. The healthcare provider might ask questions about their behaviors and evaluate those answers in combination with information from the screening tools and clinical observations of the child, okay? So if a child shows developmental differences in behavior or functioning during those screenings, the doctor will probably refer the child for additional screening, okay? So this is just to let you know that we don't just hand out diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder willy-nilly. It is a process. It is an intense screening process that's multi-layered, and it's not something that is just flippantly handed out to any random person who thinks they have it, okay? It might seem like that because there's a lot of more diagnoses coming out, but again, it's because we're screening more often, okay? So you have to think generations before, it wasn't that people didn't have autism spectrum disorder, it's just nobody was catching it, right? No one was looking for it. And now we are, which is great. So stage 2, young children, diagnosis in young children is often that 2-stage process. So here's stage 2. Again, it is very important to accurately detect and diagnose children with autism spectrum disorder as early as possible so that we can shed light on their unique strengths and their challenges. Early detection also helps with you as the caregiver to determine which services or educational programs or behavioral therapies that are most likely to be helpful for your child, okay? And so it looks like this. Medical and neurological examinations, right? They're going to look at the body and the brain. They're going to look at your child's cognitive abilities. They're going to look at their speech and language abilities, their behaviors. They're going to have an in-depth conversation with you as the caregiver about their behaviors and development because you're going to know more than they do in that, half hour, 35, 40-minute screening. They're going to assess age-appropriate skills needed to complete daily activities independently, like eating, dressing, toileting. And then they're also going to ask questions about the family history, okay? So a team of healthcare providers who have experience in diagnosing ASD, they're going to conduct these diagnostic evaluations. Okay, these are going to be trained professionals who specialize in this area. And so that could look like a team with child neurologists, developmental behavioral pediatricians, speech language pathologists, child psychologists, psychiatrists, educational therapists, or specialist occupational therapists. Okay, because it is a complex disorder that sometimes occurs with other illnesses or other learning disorders, this comprehensive evaluation may include blood tests, hearing tests, things like that. And the outcome of the evaluation might result in a formal diagnosis and recommendations for treatment, okay? And so caregivers and teachers are often the first to recognize the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder in older children and adolescents who attend school, okay? So if they weren't diagnosed younger, they weren't screened for it, it wasn't caught when they were younger, it may creep up in adolescents, children, and young adults, and be caught by caregivers, right? Or be caught by teachers and say, hey, maybe we need to get you evaluated, right? So a child's caregivers may talk with healthcare providers about how their social difficulties are manifesting, or how they're maybe having difficulty with subtle communications. And the subtle communication differences might include problems like understanding tone of voice, facial expressions, body language, picking up on sarcasm, things like that. And older children and adolescents, they may have trouble understanding figures of speech, humor, things like that. And they also have trouble, or can have trouble, forming friendships with peers, especially if you can think back to your adolescent years, your teenage years. And it's very tricky to navigate that space, even without an autism diagnosis, because we're learning social cues, right? We're learning social norms. We're learning how to interact with other humans. And if you have a disorder that maybe hinders that a little bit, it's going to be exponentially more difficult for you to form those friendships with peers. So how we diagnose in adults. So diagnosing ASD in adults is often a lot more difficult than diagnosing it in children. In adults, some symptoms can overlap with symptoms of other mental health disorders like anxiety disorder or ADHD disorder. And also, you know, if you've grown up without a diagnosis of autism, you don't know you have autism, you're probably very, very skilled at hiding, right? You're masking that autism, which of course leads to a lot of anxiety and things like that. But adults who notice signs and symptoms of ASD should talk to their healthcare provider and ask for a referral or an evaluation for it, right? Although the evaluation for autism in adults is still being refined, adults can refer to neuropsychologists, psychologists, psychiatrists who have experience with ASD. And that expert is going to ask about how do they interact socially, and do they have any communication challenges? Do they have any sensory issues? That's usually the one that really gets people thinking, maybe I have this disorder because, you know, I feel these lights in my brain, you know, that kind of thing. When the lights are on overhead, I can't handle it. Maybe they're going to ask them about repetitive behaviors, restricted interest, right? Maybe they've got that that one thing, that one topic that they're just super knowledgeable about. It's very intense interest for them. And the evaluation might also include a conversation with, you know, other family members, or if they have caregivers that, you know, are in their space a lot. And that's just to learn about their early developmental history. And that can also ensure an accurate diagnosis. Okay, again, a lot of these symptoms pop up before they're 2 years old. So mom might not have got you screened for autism back in the day because that wasn't a thing that they did, but she remembers some of these behaviors and can say, oh yeah, I remember when Johnny used to do that. I didn't know that was autism. Okay, so they may ask questions from your parents or whomever raised you. And so, of course, when you get a correct diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder as an adult, that can help you understand some of these past challenges you've had. It can help you identify personal strengths and find the right kind of help, right? So a lot of people are happy to get diagnosed because they think, oh, now it all makes sense, right? I'm not crazy, I'm not weird, I'm not strange, I just have autism, right? And studies are underway to determine the types of services and supports that are most helpful for improving that functioning and community integration of autistic transition age youth and adults, right? Because it's one thing to be diagnosed early, and your whole life you've been learning how to manage the challenges that arise with autism spectrum disorder. But if you're not getting diagnosed until later, that can be really difficult to transition from, a young person to an adult while trying to understand this diagnosis. Okay, so there's a lot of improvements being made in how we treat the older people diagnosed with autism, which I think is great. So what are those treatment options? So treatment for autism should begin as soon as possible, obviously after diagnosis. Early treatment is important because that proper care and services can reduce a person's difficulty while helping them learn new skills and build on their strengths, right? And people with autism spectrum disorder, they may face a wide range of issues, which means there's no single best treatment, right? There's no magic pill that you can pop and say this is going to fix everything, right? But working closely with your healthcare provider, that's really crucial and important part of finding the right combination of treatment and services, okay? So a healthcare provider may prescribe medication to treat specific symptoms. And with medication, a person with ASD may have fewer problems with irritability, aggression, repetitive behavior, hyperactivity, attention, and anxiety and depression. And I would venture to say that the anxiety and depression component, although medicated, I think even just having that understanding that you do have autism can help alleviate some of those symptoms. At least I know it's true for some people that I care about. All right, and we're going to continue on for treatment options that are behavioral, psychological, and educational. So if you have autism spectrum disorder or you're caring for a loved one who has been diagnosed with it, you may be referred to providers who specialize in behavioral, psychological education or skill building interventions. And so they're usually highly structured and intense, and they might involve everyone in your circle. So your parents, caregivers, siblings, or other family members that are close to you. And they can help you learn social skills, communication skills, language skills, reduce behaviors that interfere with daily functioning, right? Maybe you have a hard time in your place of work, right? In your work environment, maybe is a sensory gumbo of chaos and pain, and it's hard for you to get to work every day, but you can get treatment, and somebody can help you cope with some of those, right? They can help you increase or build on your strengths, and of course, learn life skills for living independently. And these needs are going to vary depending on the person and which hue of the spectrum they find themselves placed on, okay? So what are some tips for you as a caregiver? And I'm going to try to go through these quickly, but concisely. So here's some tips that can help you care for someone with autism. First and foremost, learn how to communicate with them, okay? I think whether we have a diagnosis or not, it's always a very crucial component to how we care for others is how we communicate with them, right? And so people with autism, it's no different. But for many people with autism, communication can be very challenging. Some children with autism are nonverbal, so they don't even talk at all. They choose not to speak, or maybe they can't for whatever reason. And so you have to develop creative ways to communicate with them. Many children with autism do really well with visual communication. Next, be patient, right? Patience is vital when caring for a person in general, but also it's very true for people who have autism. Their social and communication skills are often underdeveloped. Not that they aren't there, they just might be underdeveloped, and it can be hard to get through to them. And so patience is key, right? I know just in my life growing up with children who don't have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, but they do have some diagnoses that are very similar. And it would be very frustrating for me to have to repeat myself or have to find new ways to communicate with them. And so I had to be very, very patient, I had to learn how to be patient, let them process. And that can be a challenge if you're not aware, right? If you don't know that that's what they need from you. Next, create a schedule and stick to it. So children and adults with autism really benefit a lot from structure and schedule. And if you deviate from that schedule, it can throw them off. And children with autism tend to thrive with a consistent schedule. So stick to consistent bedtimes and meal times if you can. And if there is going to be a change in the schedule, just let them know beforehand so they can have that time to process it and figure out, how they want to go forward, right? schedule time for play. So in between school and therapy, children with autism and work and therapy, adults with autism can feel very, very inundated, very overwhelmed. And so it's really good idea to schedule time to unwind and play, okay? And it can be a little tricky trying to figure out what your kiddo likes to do for fun, because they're unlikely to unwind with other kids. This is where observation is going to be one of your best friends, right? What is it that Johnny does when he wants to soothe himself, when he wants to rest, when he wants to wind down, right? And make space for that, okay? And if you're an adult on the spectrum, what are some things that you need to do as you transition? So, some kids, they struggle with transitioning from school to home, right? So that in between time can be very chaotic for them. And adults transitioning from work to home can also be very chaotic. And so you have to learn ways to kind of give that space to breathe, that transition to breathe, so that they can ground themselves in that shift, okay? Next. Many of the common behaviors seen in children with autism might be deemed problems in other kids. So this is where we're going to get into expressions of autism versus defiance or disobedience or misbehavior, okay? So for example, children with autism, they might screech or yell when they're overwhelmed or frustrated. And that resonates with me because sometimes when I'm frustrated or overwhelmed, I would love to screech and yell, but I know the social norms, and so I don't. But children in general, they haven't learned those things yet, and a child with autism is going to have a more difficult time restricting that behavior, okay? They may bolt from the room, they might hit other people or even injure themselves when they're upset. They're not going to look directly at a person when speaking. And in our American culture, that is seen as disrespect. It's not so in all cultures, but in ours it is. And so a child who's not looking directly at a person while they're speaking can be disciplined for being disrespectful. They may rock, flick their fingers, pace when they're expected to sit still, right? They just got that energy running through them. They may seem self-absorbed or inattentive to events or emotions around them. In school, children with autism might overreact or underreact to other people's requests or needs. So an example would be pushing other children in line or ignoring requests to move or to hurry. And they may have difficulty responding to kindness. So children with autism may also have a tough time managing the responses to adults or peer kindness. And so these may be some familiar examples for parents or caregivers of children with autism. So here's an example. The grandparent comes to visit, they see their grandchild, they open their arms and they ask for a big hug, right? But then the grandchild runs in the opposite direction at top speed, right? So the grandparent follows them and gives them that hug only to be rewarded with a kick in the shins, right? Or grandparent gives their grandchild a gift and the grandchild says, at an age where they should know better, they should know to just accept a gift and say thank you. They'll say, I don't like this. I wanted a bike instead, right? Or I wanted a doll instead, right? And the last example, a peer from school agrees to a play date and finds themselves ignored for several hours while the child with autism plays alone. Or the guest may spend 2 hours being told, don't touch that. All of these behaviors can lead to hurt or angry feelings, obviously. Yet all can be autistic traits and in most cases result from sensory or communication or behavioral challenges that are common with people with autism. So I have a daughter who has a friend who has autism spectrum disorder, and these things come up a lot, right? And so my daughter sometimes feels, like she gets her feelings hurt. And so we just have to have that conversation with, it's not that you weren't wanted there, you were invited to come and play. It's just, this is how they play, right? Or this is how they visit, and it's different, okay? So just being aware can go a long way. Let's see, sensory challenges. So this is how we're going to distinguish autism from misbehaving, okay? So autistic behaviors are usually the result of a few very specific type of challenges. So of course, because every autistic or person with autism is unique, the challenges will look different for each person, but they exist at some level in anyone with a correct diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, okay? So sensory challenge. People with autism are almost always likely to either overreact or underreact to light, smells, and touch, or light, smells, sound, and touch, right? Think of our five senses. A child who runs away from a grandparent might actually be responding to the smell of their perfume, right? Give grandma a hug. Oh, you smell funny, and they take off running, right? And a child who hates hugs might not really like the sensation of being squeezed, but they still feel affection towards the person doing the hugging. They just don't like to be hugged, right? And so a sensory challenge can be something as minor as the buzz from fluorescent lights. And sensory challenges may also be the reason behind what we would see or consider misbehavior. So when in a crowded or loud auditorium or squeezed between people when standing in line, that can create an overwhelm or an overload, right? And so how do you tell when sensory issues are causing a problem? So take these steps. Ask. If a child is verbal, they may be perfectly capable of explaining their behaviors at ask. Why did you run away from grandma when she tried to give you a hug, right? Why is it that when we went to the grocery store, you put your hands over your ears, right? Just ask them. Watch. If a child is covering their ears while bolting from the room, it's reasonable to assume that something about the sound in the room is causing a problem, right? Maybe the sound of the fish tank is bugging them out. Maybe somebody chewing is bugging them out, right? We don't know. But we just watch and keep observing. And keep tabs on those behaviors. So if a child is unusually able to handle, for example, or if they're usually able to handle like a worship service, but on one occasion becomes loud and they run out of the room, it's pretty apparent that something specific has occurred to cause that behavior, right? If they're normally okay in a worship service, then all of a sudden they're not okay. What happened, right? But if the behavior is consistent, there may be an ongoing sensory challenge in the environment, right? Maybe it's the lights. A lot of these modern worship services will have, crazy colorful lights and booming music and smoke machines or what have you. And that can be very overwhelming for someone who has sensitivity to sensory input, okay? Social communication challenges. So people with autism have a tough time with social communication on some level or another, and it can be difficult or even impossible to read other people's emotions, or very difficult to avoid overreacting to their feelings. It can be very tough to watch and imitate other people's behaviors. So the fact that other people are sitting still and being quiet might not register for a child with autism that that's what they're supposed to be doing, right? So what are the signs that they're having difficulties with social communication? Notice their intent, right? So difficulties with social communication, they can make it hard for a child with autism to tell if their actions are being hurtful or not, right? My daughter's friend didn't know that when she ignored her for an hour and a half when she came over that was hurting her feelings. She had no idea, right? But when she told her, it made sense and she apologized and that was the end of it, right? Let's see. Remember that children with autism have developmental delays. So a neurotypical 12-year-old should be able to graciously thank a grandparent for a gift that they don't really want. A typical 8-year-old may not be able to handle that situation as well. So a child with autism will often appear immature for their age, or a teenager with autism may behave much like a younger child. Okay, so just remember where they are on the spectrum, okay, and where they are in their development. And also be aware of how you provide instruction. So if a teacher says a child is misbehaving at recess by they're pushing in line or taking extra long turn on the swings, but children with autism, because they rarely learn through imitation, they need direct instruction on behavioral expectations, right? So did the teacher actually tell them about the rules of recess play? Did they provide visual supports or social stories, right? If not, how are they expected to know the rules? So they may have a difficulty picking up on those subtle implied rules that the rest of us just kind of absorb ambiently, right? They have to be directly communicated. We don't push in line. We don't take long turns on the swings. We have to think about other people, okay? All right. So behavioral challenges. Self-stimulation or stimming, okay? So these are physical behaviors like rocking, pacing, flicking their fingers, humming to calm themselves and stay focused, okay? Lack of eye contact, again, for many people with autism, that's difficult, if not impossible, during a conversation, okay? You may see some self-abuse behaviors, banging their head, picking at skin, other behaviors that are not intentional, they can be harmful and should be managed, okay? Lack of focus or attention, and noise making or bolting. So they might be screeching, humming, chattering to calm themselves, or maybe bolting from the room to get away from a disturbing situation, right? If you're really intensely affected by fluorescent lights buzzing, you're going to want to get out of that room as quickly as possible, okay? I know I'm running out of time and I hate to go through this too quickly, but I will have this this presentation when I did last time. Somehow I got through it a lot quicker. So if you want to watch that recording, you can. If not, I'm more than happy to share my slides with you, okay? So let's go through here quickly. Let me see here if I can skip through some of these slides. Let's talk a little bit about the autistic meltdowns, okay? Because a lot of times people think that these are just temper tantrums and they respond in a very unfruitful way, okay? So an autistic meltdown is involuntary, okay? And this is a response to a nervous system overload, okay? So this is when they are highly dysregulated, and it's not a behavioral issue, but it is a manifestation of a neurobiological reaction, okay? So a meltdown is bigger, more emotional, longer lasting, and more difficult to manage than a temper tantrum, and they have different causes, okay? So a tantrum is typically going to be done out of manipulation to get something that you want, right? Crying, causing a scene, screaming. But an autistic meltdown is not manipulation, okay? These are genuine cries of distress, okay? So it's important to be aware that behaviors are not a response to stress or sensory overload and not a form of manipulation, okay? Some autistic meltdowns vary, but the intensity but it may include biting, crying, destroying property, foot stomping, hitting, kicking, running off, zoning out, self-injury, stimming, throwing and breaking objects, and vocal outbursts. Again, this is happening because their brain is going into that fight, flight, or freeze mode from overwhelming emotions. So it is an involuntary reaction and cannot be controlled by that person, okay? So if your child has autism, they're having a meltdown, you can't just say, stop and behave. Stop that behavior, right? They can't stop it. So you really do have to try to catch it early or just let it ride out, okay? How do you prevent it? So recognize those triggers, right? That sensory overload, that is a common meltdown trigger. And so that can be lights, smells, sounds, different textures, right? Maybe the seam in their sock is really wrecking with their little toes and they're having a really hard time with that and they can't handle it, okay? They have no threshold to handle it. So knowing what the triggers are, you can find ways to avoid them or make them more manageable, okay? And of course, heed the warnings. Keep an eye out for those subtle signs of overwhelm. Take action to eliminate the cause or move the child to a calmer space. If you see your child kind of upticking in these behaviors, maybe get them to a quiet space where they can calm down. Give them some kind of sensory thing that calms them down, okay? So calming music, a cold drink, a cozy blanket, dimming the lights, being empathetic and kind, a weighted blanket for older children. Of course, you want to put a weighted blanket on a toddler. Silence, right? Fresh air. These are all things that you can do to kind of what's what I'm looking for? Like not reverse the meltdown, but maybe decrease its intensity. Okay. So here are some helpful resources online for families. There's the childrensnational.org. You can click Get Care to find the autism resources. Autism Parenting Magazine is a great resource. You can get a free issue of their magazine as well as free articles on their website. And then, of course, the cdc.gov website. That'll give you all the up-to-date, accurate, and peer-reviewed clinical information and national resources about autism. I apologize I had to go through that last part as quickly as I did, but I appreciate you sticking with me. And of course, here are my sources. And if you're interested in these sources and you'd like them emailed to you, please let me know, and I'm more than happy to do that for you. Okay, so let me stop my share. And maybe my recording. There we go.